Welcome, everybody. Thank you to Project Inspired and Rabbi Barnett for sponsoring this. Tonight's topic about the afterlife, different aspects of the afterlife, evidence, what it is. I want to start with a story that's actually found in this book called Closer to the Light by Dr. Melvin Morse. He's an MD who studied near-death experiences in the 1980s, 1990s, and the unique angle that he did as a professional MD, he studied the near-death experiences of young children, 3-year-old, 4-year-olds, and the reason he did that is because it's harder for a 3-year-old, 4-year-old to make up a story. So that made that his experiences and his information, much more authentic. It's an interesting book. It's a fascinating book. I may bring some other examples in it, but there's one particular point that he makes that I wanted to start this lecture with. And he says there that, and I'm going to get into how this ties in with my book Soul Searching, but he says there, there are various types of near-death experiences that have been documented over the years since the 1970s. My book Soul Searching actually compares the evidence or the information about near-death experiences in the 1970s and since then to ancient Jewish teachings that show parallels between the two. So these experiences have actually been documented over thousands of years. But Dr. Morse talks one of the things he talks about is the light experience. So in a near-death experience, a person that is clinically ill, typically there's four major experiences. It's four major experiences. They have an out-of-body experience, they have what's called a tunnel experience, they have what's called a light experience, and then they have what's called a life review. So when it comes, it's interesting that Dr. Morse in his studies found out that not everybody, all these doctors that documented near-death experiences, they discovered that not everybody who claims to have a near-death experience, and there was a Gallup poll in the 1980s that 8 million Americans had near-death experiences. But not everybody has all four or all multiple experiences. What he found fascinating was that the light experience was a key for how the experience would affect a person. If a person didn't have a light experience, didn't see a light in part of his experience of a near-death, he went on with his life and nothing changed much. But those that did have a very real light experience of a light, which a light could be a being, a sense of something higher, those that did have it, he did a study and he found that they were healthier and had fewer psychosomatic complaints. They were happier, they had stronger family ties, more zest for living, greater diminished fear of death. Interesting here, almost no suicide attempts to kill themselves again. Some of the people he had studied were teenagers who actually tried to commit suicide, and they failed. And those that didn't have the light experience would statistically try it again, and those that did have it all of a sudden didn't. So here are people that are already on the edge, and the light experience turned their lives around. So it's very interesting because the question that I started looking into, and when I'm going to get to about the history of this book, looking into about 30 years ago, was one would think that if a person has a near-death experience, and it's a wonderful experience, not all are, but it's a wonderful experience like seeing the light, one might think that a person would come back and say, you know what, I don't want to live anymore, there's no purpose in this life. But Dr. Morse has the book and others specific have shown otherwise, that when a person does have a real serious near-death experience, and according to Dr. Morse, especially with light involved, they changes their life. They have a new zest and a new outlook on life. And the goal of this class, and the goal of my book, and the goal really of everything that we do in Torah, is to try and capture that zest without having to go have a near-death experience. I don't recommend near-death experiences if you can avoid them. If you have them, then you'll. That's the way. Hopefully it was something that was very good in your life. But if the question here is, can we capsulize the effects of a near-death experience in our everyday lives through what methods? And the reality is that yes, we can, and that's exactly what Torah teaches, and that's really what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Some of the evidence that has been uncovered, and some of the ideas of what to do once that evidence is uncovered, and how we might use it and incorporate it into our lives. Now, it happens to be that for whatever reason, about 30 years ago, the idea of Olam Haba, of an afterlife, was something that I gravitated toward, or it gravitated toward me. And in 1994, I wrote this book. At that point, I was working for a very great and important American rabbi in outreach called Rabbi Israel Tauber. And he was very involved in teaching people in these seminars called Arachim seminars, and he set up a yeshiva in Monsey, New York called Or Samech. But for 6 years, I was able to work with him hand in hand, and I wrote about 13 books for him. So it was a great experience, apprenticeship for me, really, actually. One of the things that happened in 1994 is that I noticed that these seminars that they were giving, that were very popular, they talked about all the different proofs or evidence of Judaism, of the Torah on Mount Sinai, the Revelation, and all different aspects to the Torah, but it did not, and the lectures did actually talk about afterlife, but there was no books about it. So with Rabbi Tauber, we decided to go ahead and do a research into this book. And essentially the idea here is that soul searching, seeking scientific ground for the Jewish tradition of an afterlife. The purpose of this book was initially written for people that were not observant yet, people that were not believing in Torah. And so to help people understand what's going on, or how people get to the next level, what I did is I studied a lot of near-death experience, the literature on near-death experiences, and as well as there's a Dr. Ian Stevenson. We'll talk more about that, about reincarnation. And I took those ideas that had been in the literature since the 1970s especially, and I compared them to sources in the Torah. And I found that it was uncanny again and again, these things lined up. This is one of the pieces of evidence, let's say, that I had been researching. And it's interesting, in 1994 I wrote this book, and with Rabbi Tauber it sort of fell out of his project, and I went and tried to publish it on my own. And I had an inside person at Simon & Schuster, and she was a high-level type of agent, and I got in to talk to her, and she said she loved the book, but it was a little too Jewish for her. You know, the secular sources was good, but the Jewish part, connecting to Judaism, was too Jewish for her and her readers. Next, I took the book and I went to a Jewish publisher. I went to several Jewish publishers, and they said, wonderful book, fantastic. Yeah, but too secular for us. The science and it doesn't work for us. It took 10 years before Targum Press and Rabbi Dambi looked it over and said, you know what? This is the perfect combination of a secular and a religious point of view that ties them together. And in fact, it's interesting that Rabbi Dambi said that he decided to publish the book not primarily for a secular or a non-observant yet type of community, but actually religious ones. He felt that a lot of young women and young men, this book would be a great benefit to them. So this book was published in 2004. After 10 years lying around. And it has had an interesting life in terms of reaching out to people of all different types, people that are not observant, people that are not yet believing in the tenets of the Torah, and people that are. I've seen some interesting comments of people over the years. One woman even converted to Judaism, she says, as one of the books that helped to do it. Other people have told me it's helped them tremendously. A friend of mine who works as a chaplain in a hospital, he said that he's given that book to his people that have been dying, and it's given them a lot of insight. Well, this was in 2004. A few years ago, I got involved, and I work closely with the material of this Rabbi Avigdor Miller. And a couple of years ago, I published this book, Rabbi Avigdor Miller on Olam Haba. I have a lot of books out there, about 25, 30 that I've written or edited or published, and this has been my bestseller. The way I look at these two books, and I'm not going to mention it here, is that this is the book for a person that is not there yet and needs the evidence to show that there is such a thing as an afterlife. This is a book, after you've graduated, so to speak, from this book, this would be the next book to go into. I would not necessarily recommend this for beginners, but I would say that if you're beyond the beginner stage, then this is an interesting book. The combination is basically evidence to help a person, even with a secular background, feel that it's not that there is a rational basis for believing in an afterlife. And then what do you do with it? And that's really the bigger question here, because what you do with it, as we saw from the beginning from Melvin Morse, from the light, the idea is to use the principles and the thoughts about an afterlife to improve our lives, to create this tremendous zest for life. And in fact, one of the classic Jewish writings, The Duties of the Heart, written about 1,000 years ago. He says that the most important part of our belief, of our emunah, of our belief system, is the belief in the afterlife. If the Yetzer Hara, which is this tendency, this evil inclination, had his first and most important, or his last and most important attack, is on the belief of an afterlife, that the soul somehow lives on beyond the body. And if he can get the person to disbelieve in that, he knows he's got him. All these other things, he could say he believes in the Torah from Sinai, he could believe in these other things. If he doesn't believe in an afterlife, everything else falls apart. So we have some serious sources that this is not just a side, it's not a footnote of Judaism, it's a total core idea, the belief in the afterlife, and and what to do with that belief. Now, I'm not going to go into the sources. There are a lot of sources I have in the book about, for instance, in the Tanakh where you see this from, and in the Talmud where you see this from. But we're going to go over some of the things here. I'm going to go into the book, and then we'll see how far we can get with going into other areas. But basically here, it's interesting. In 1984, I was still in yeshiva, and I got a job writing a show called Taste of Torah. It was a radio show, and the narrator, I would basically put together different lectures from two different rabbis, and then I put together and add a narrator, and it would seem like one seamless type of thing. So we had a narrator, a guy named Peretz Eichler, a wonderful voice, and Peretz, his innovation is that before we started Taste of Torah every night or every week when it was on, he'd say, you give us 40 minutes, we'll give you the world to come. There was a famous radio station called WINS, says, you give us 20 minutes, we'll give you the world. Peretz said, you give us 40 minutes, we'll give you the world to come. So that's sort of what this idea is about. Give us 40 minutes, and we'll give you the world to come. Now, as I said earlier, there are different aspects to the near-death experience, but I'm going to mention there's four, and we're going to go focus in on maybe just one or two of them. The first one is the out-of-body experience. And that is when a person, and there's lots of literature out there about people that claim to have near-death experiences, and they had out-of-body experiences. So if a person's lying on the operating table, and their heart stops for a few minutes, and then when they come back to life, they claim that they had seen certain things, they had floated above the body, had seen certain things. One of the interesting things that caught my attention in early days was a woman that claimed to have floated above her body, that was on the operating table. Out the window was a hospital up on the 20th floor, whatever it is, and there on the ledge on the 20th floor was a shoe, one shoe. No one could see it from the ground, and no one could see it from the window. So afterwards, the doctors and the nurses went to check, in fact, if the shoe was there, because no one could have seen it in a normal situation, and it was. So there's stuff like that, different stories like that. Does Judaism believe in that? Of course we do. We have statements that say that when a person is before the person is buried, his body floats above it and is above it and is watching and listening to everything that's happening that's said as at his funeral. Which is a very profound idea, because at the funeral a lot of people are grieving, the close relatives and so forth. But here we have the actual person's soul is grieving, because he's also watching it. In fact, when a person we have to do in Jewish law, when a person dies, the body has to be cleansed, and while the people that are very trained to do this are cleansing the body, excuse me. While they're cleansing the body, they have to apologize. Oh, I'm sorry for doing this. I'm sorry for doing that. That only makes sense if their belief is that the body is floating nearby. So we clearly have these studies that have started in the 70s that are talking about out-of-body experiences. This is old material in the Jewish world. This is an example of what I wanted to show, are parallel types of things. I mentioned the light experience. I want to talk about the fourth one, and then we're going to move on to a different topic. But basically, again, the idea here is to show that there are parallels. So the fourth major experience, near-death experience, is what's called the life review. And this is experience has been reported by a lot of people. So a person has a near-death experience. They're on the operating table. They floated above the body. They've gone through this tunnel. A tunnel experience is one of the common things. Judaism has an idea that every soul, before it goes up to its heavenly abode, goes through the cave where Abraham and Sarah are buried in Hebron. Sort of like a tunnel. Anyway, tunnel experience, the light experience. They see light. Sometimes the light is a being, sometimes it's relatives, sometimes it's an undescribable thing. And then they often come to what's called a life review, where they're actually somehow there's either a judgment or something happening, but that their life is reviewed. I want to read you one or two quotes from, again, these are secular sources that scientists have documented over the years. There's lots of different books. They're mentioned in my book. You can go into further detail in there. Well, let me read you one or two to get an idea of what the life review is, and then I want to compare it to the Jewish sources. Here, this is from the book Heading Toward Omega. Quote, "It was like I knew everything that was stored in my brain. Everything I'd ever known about from the beginning of my life, I immediately knew about. And also what was kind of scary was that I knew everybody else in the room, in this afterlife, knew I knew, and that there was no hiding anything. The good times, the bad times, everything. I had a total clear knowledge of everything. I realized that there are things that every person is sent to earth to realize and to learn. Every single thing that you do in your life is recorded, and that even though you pass it by not thinking at the time, it always comes up later. For instance, you may be at a stoplight, and you're in a hurry, and the lady in front of you, when the light turns green, doesn't take right off. She doesn't notice the light, and you get upset and start honking your horn and telling her to hurry up. Those are the little kinds of things that are recorded that you don't realize at the time that are really important." It was very interesting because, if you're familiar with it, the book of, in Judaism, we have the book called the Ethics of the Fathers. These are famous statements by the rabbis from 2,000 years ago that are actually based on an older tradition. And one of the statements in the book, in the Ethics of the Fathers, is that all a person's deeds are written in a book. And just like this person says here, that everything is being recorded. Now here, this sounds a little bit on the scary side, because she's saying, well, this person is recording that everything's there, and if you're honking at the little old lady in front of you, and you feel bad about that. There's other stories, for instance, that one person had a life review, and all of a sudden she remembered the time that she was in a department store, and the little girl was alone and not by herself and crying, and she went over and took that little girl to the counter and waited there until her mother came. And she said in her life review, the pleasure of the good deed there was just magnified in a way that was unbelievable, impossible to describe. And so the life review is a review of the good things and the bad things. And the ultimate idea is to purge the bad and to come to reconcile it. Some of these near-death experience people have called it psychoanalysis in the umpteenth degree. And the idea is that a person needs to cleanse that which he did not or she did not do right in this world, and you need to emphasize the good as well. It's a matter of toning down when you experience the bad and you acknowledge it. It's sort of like cathartic, and it reduces the pinch in the bad. And at the same time, you're emphasizing the good things that you do, which is a very important thing. Sometimes people are so super critical that they forget the good. We have good and bad, and we need to do that on our everyday lives. The life experience is that experience times a million. It's a different level. One of the things the Talmud says is that who testifies at one's judgment after death? And the Gemara and the Talmud answers one's own soul, which is very interesting. You would think that there's fire and brimstone and there's outsiders that are doing it, but the process and the goal of the life review is for the soul or the personality itself, our own essence, to admit and acknowledge both the good and to acknowledge the bad and the good, and therefore to hopefully be something cathartic about it. It's interesting that the Jewish idea of Gehenna, which is where the life, you could say, the life review is done. We have the word Gehenna, and it's not really properly translated as hell. It's really properly translated as purgatory. The Talmud tells us that this is ultimately, for the vast majority of people, not more than 11 months. And it's a place where the negative things are purged. That's why it's called purgatory, from the soul. It could be a very painful process psychologically or spiritually, and it has to go, and everyone has to go through it. Maybe if a person lives his life here, maybe that's minimal. Maybe they don't have to go and experience it all. The great saints and tzaddikim, don't have to experience. But The rest of the majority of the population does, probably to some degree, and that seems to be something parallel to this life review. I say this with a caveat, by the way. I don't. This is not to say that everything that you read in these books about near-death experience is the same that's happening, in the Torah explanation of things. But the parallels are very interesting to study, and that brings up evidence about common experiences, from today and from thousands of years ago. Now, it's very interesting that in this week, on the portion of the week that we read on the Sabbath, and this Sabbath we're going to read about how Joseph was finally revealed himself to his brothers. He had for many years they thought he might have died, and they didn't know where he was, and he knew who they were, but he was holding back and not telling anybody who he was. And all of a sudden, in this week's parsha, his brother Yehuda is saying, our father really can't afford to lose his one child. He already lost one. He can't lose another one. And then Joseph all of a sudden says, I am Joseph, my father alive. And they were quiet. It says they had a bahala. They were confused, quiet. They just were totally shocked. You can imagine. And there's a midrash, there's a oral teaching that says that this experience that the brothers had when Joseph revealed and says, I am Joseph, is similar to what the experience of the soul when it gets to the next world. We live in a world where we rationalize. There probably more than eating and drinking, we live our days with rationalizations, justifying things that may not be so good. To rationalize is to tell rational lies. And everybody has to, it seems like it's a very natural thing for people to do. But when you come to that world where everything else is stripped away, it's like Joseph. That's why the brothers could not even speak to him. They were completely naked now. All the things that they had done, they couldn't fool this person because he was the person that they had sent away into slavery. So too the soul in the afterlife, where we live with our rationalizations and we think we get away with, we're getting away with things. But coming to the next world, it's something that's very serious and yet very cathartic and purging, for purgatory. So that's the idea of a life review, and the idea here in this world is that if we do tshuva, if we do repentance in this world, we can already preempt the process of the next world. That's the ultimate process of tshuva in the next world, a life review. In this world, we're trying to think about things and improve ourselves, and if we can improve ourselves in this world, it says one moment of repentance in this world is better than all the pleasures in the world to come. So this is one of the motivating things when you learn about these things. It's not to make someone depressed. It's quite the opposite. It's trying to make someone very active now in improving themselves, improving their character, improving their behavior toward others, and improving their behavior toward themselves and toward God. So this is part of the purging process, part of the life review. I want to close the life review part of my speech here with a quote from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Right? If you don't know Rabbi Kaplan, you must read his books. If you're new to Judaism, he is Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan died, unfortunately, as a young man, and he was 48 years old. But he wrote many books, and one of them is called The Immortality and the Soul, and he writes a very fascinating thing here. There was a philosopher, Henry Bergson, whose idea is that the soul actually sees everything. When we come to this body, it's like it's reduced. It's like this static, and everything is staticky. It's not that our minds are actually a restriction of what a bigger subconscious or superconscious has, and understands everything. We're here in a restricted world, in a world where the truth is covered by noise, white static and noise static. So Rabbi Kaplan writes here a fascinating thing in this book, again, Immortality and the Soul. Imagine standing naked before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent, without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You will remember everything you ever did. The memory of every good deed would be the sublimest of pleasures, but your memory will also be open to all the things which you are ashamed. They cannot be rationalized or away or dismissed. Rationalize. You can't tell. You can't rationalize. Telling rationalize doesn't work. You will be facing yourself, fully aware of the consequences of all your deeds. We all know the terrible shame and humiliation when one is caught in the act of doing something wrong. Imagine being caught by one's own memory with no place to escape. Again, these ideas are to teach us, maybe then we should go back and apologize to that person we might have hurt. Maybe we should improve our ways and the whole patterns of life. That's the idea here. And the idea here is that if it happens in this world in a smaller way, but in a way where we have the free will to make the impact even greater, and it's ultimately in a place in the next world. So this idea of these are some of the parallels that, again, are in the book Soul Searching about near-death experiences. One of the topics that I got into back then also was reincarnation. And it's interesting how this came up. So I mentioned Rabbi Ezriel Tauber. Rabbi Ezriel Tauber was a Hasidic Jew, all the Yiddish, and a big, great scholar, and a very broad-minded person. But yet, one morning he told me when I came into work, he said, "You must read this book." And it was shocking to me because it was a secular book and it sounded very strange. It was a book by a man named Dr. Brian Weiss, and it was called Many Lives, Many Masters. And I couldn't believe that Rabbi Tauber actually recommended that I read it. Well, I read it. I took it home. He gave me a copy, and I took it home, and I expected to, read a little bit here, read a little bit there. I got into it, and I stayed up half the night reading it. Sometime in the middle of the night, my wife woke up and said, "What are you doing? Why are you staying up so late? You're going to be exhausted in the morning." I said I couldn't put down the book. So the next morning, I was pretty exhausted. And the next night, she said, "Well, what is the book?" I said, "Well, why don't you read a little bit? Don't have to stay up the whole night." So about 3, 4 in the morning, I woke up and turned over, and there's my wife. She's reading. I said, "Put it down. You're going to be exhausted in the morning." No, but it was a fascinating book. So Rabbi Talbert gave me this book. And again, I'm not going to go too much into it. There's more in the book, but I do want to share something. And I also have to say a little bit of a caveat here that this is fascinating material that Dr. Weiss had bring there, but there are certain things about Dr. Weiss's post, our experience with him. I met him, and Rabbi Tauber spoke together with him, and there are certain things about Dr. Weiss that I would say that have gone off the way from Judaism. However, the basic idea has been pretty fascinating. Let me tell you what his, if you don't know his story, it's pretty fascinating. Many Lives, Many Masters. So Dr. Weiss is a Yale-trained psychiatrist, not just a MD, not just a psychologist, but a MD and a psychiatrist. And he's trained in the best universities, and he was actually the head of the Department of Psychiatry, I believe, in Sinai Hospital in Florida. So he had written papers. And he called himself the original skeptic, a real big skeptic in terms of afterlife and religion in total. And in the 1981, I think it was, 81, a patient came, he was told to a patient that was going to come into someone from the university there. This woman was having tremendous phobias, and Dr. Weiss, and they thought that Dr. Weiss could help her. And he called her Catherine. That's not her real name, but he called her Catherine in the book. And he came in there and he documented, her problems. She has so many phobias. Everybody has fears, but phobia means they're really extreme. So she was so afraid that she'd wake up in the middle of the night and go into a closet and fall asleep. She was terrified of the dark, yet she'd go into the closet. She was terrified of the water and could barely, use a shower. So she had these terrible phobias. And Dr. Weiss, one of her phobias, by the way, was she had a fear of drowning and swallowing. This was terrible for the psychologist because he really liked to give pills. You give a pill and all of a sudden, poof, the person's somewhat better. But he couldn't do it because she was afraid of choking. So he decided that he was experimenting then with something called with hypnosis, and he decided to use hypnosis to try and help her. So the very first session, he did hypnotize her, and she went back to the early childhood, where she had some traumatic experience. She almost drowned in a pool. And she had a situation with her father abused her. So it was really traumatic situations. In a dentist's office, she remembered someone putting some cloth over her face. And Dr. Weiss thought after this was done, she's going to come back a little better next week because we've uncovered these deep-seated memories that she had repressed, and these things seem to be involved with her choking and all that. But she came back the next week and she was just as bad. She's had a terrible week. So Dr. Weiss induced her into a hypnotic state again, and he said, listen, Catherine, go back to the point where your symptoms begin. And all of a sudden, she goes back to about 4,000 years ago, and she's this woman named Miranda in sort of like an Indonesian type town. They're thatched roofs, huts. Excuse me. And she has a baby, and she loves the baby. And all of a sudden, she remembers in her hypnotic state of a tsunami coming, and a huge wave is coming, and the villagers are running away, and she's running away, and it gets up to her ankles and her knees, and all of a sudden she's being swirled around, and the baby's being ripped from her arms, and then she sort of dies in this hypnotic state. And then she sort of floats up, and Dr. Weiss is, just listening, and he doesn't believe she's having any real past lives. So she That's it. He brings her out of the state. Fine. Next week she comes back. Dr. Weiss, you wouldn't believe it. All of a sudden, my fear of choking in water, it's basically gone. I don't have it anymore. And Dr. Weiss thought that was strange. But he didn't yet believe in an afterlife or souls or certainly reincarnation. But he said, you know what? Let's do it again. Let's hypnotize you with some more. So it's a really fascinating book. She goes back in various different times where she's... and each time she goes back in a time and she experiences something, it seems to relieve a phobia in this life. During one of her sessions, though, she goes back and Dr. Weiss would have her experience that life, then she'd experience the death in that life, and then he'd say, okay, she'd float above her body, sort of like an in-between state before she goes into the next body. And all of a sudden, one day she closes, in one session, she closes her eyes and she starts swinging her head from side to side. As he says in a husky voice, there are eyes, there are masters. They tell me they are master spirits. And all of a sudden she started talking very philosophically. Now this was not Catherine, Dr. Weiss said, and he felt that it was something that was different, and he had a nice philosophical conversation with her. When she came out of the trance, she said, Catherine, what do you think about the masters? She says, the golf tournament? The masters? And she knew nothing of that. Well, whereas the other past lives, like Aranda and these other things, she did remember. This in-between stage, she didn't remember. And Dr. Weiss says, this is getting stranger by the session. But you know what? She's getting better. Let's continue with it. So he continued. Then he brings her to a past life. And again, she dies. And she's in an in-between state. And all of a sudden, he said something, and this changed the doctor's life. She said, Doctor, your father and your son is here. Your son says you'll know it's him because his heart is backwards like a chicken. He says his death satisfies his parents' debts, and taught you that medicine can only go so far. Yes, and also, by the way, she said, your father Avraham is here. Now, Avraham, this is a Catholic woman, she didn't say Abraham or Abe, and she didn't say his nickname Reds. She said Avraham. And this was the age before the internet, so you couldn't look up Dr. Weiss's family, and so she knew nothing, no way of accessing this information. Especially about the child. Now, a year earlier, they had a child that did die 23 days, and it was such a traumatic thing, even the close family didn't know about it. And he died after 23 days of a heart defect, where, in fact, the idea that your heart backwards like a chicken, where it was rooted in the wrong way behind it, was a perfect description of it. And because, at that point, he was in medical school, and he was thinking, should he become a psychiatrist? When he saw that medicine couldn't save his child, he said, you know what, I want to go into medical school. And he did, in fact, change his life. He told him that medicine can go so far. She said, so at this point, he said, now this is not anything that she could know. And he said the room got cold. And the bottom line is that now he changed, all of a sudden he became a changed person. And he began to believe that, in fact, the past lives that she was having were in fact real, and they were improving her. And Dr. Weiss says that a person like Catherine, phobias come in so bad, it's very rare that they get cured, or certainly maybe they get improved a little bit, but the fact that they can get cured, in fact, she not only were they cured by the time she was done with Dr. Weiss, they went, I think, for a year or so, but she was now radiating a new life, like this, that right at the beginning when I mentioned about the closer to the light, she was having a personality revolution, that she became sort of like a very magnetic type of person. And Dr. Weiss himself now changed. And so the interesting thing about this book, well, a lot of interesting things. One of the interesting things about this book is that Dr. Weiss at this time was very respected in the quote Orthodox medical psychiatrist world. He was publishing in journals. He was the head of a major hospital psychiatry department. He had degrees from Harvard, from Yale. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by publishing this book. In fact, back in the 1980s, if you published a book, if you're a psychiatrist like him, you published a book on reincarnation, you could lose your reputation. And in fact, that is what happened. He told me, and we've seen several times, that he was not invited back to be the chair of different departments. And for a while, he was very ostracized. And while he was being ostracized in the medical world, actually students of psychiatry in universities were telling him that the teachers are secretly teaching his book, even though they're it's not officially, it's not a recognized thing. So he risked his reputation to come out with this book. It does add a layer of authenticity to his experience. And in fact, in talking to Dr. Weiss, I did meet him. I do believe that these are authentic experiences, and he's an authentic person. Again, as I said, a lot of his ideas since then, he's gone off the deep end. He's in terms of in terms of from a Jewish point of view. We have a long tradition which when there's a concept that once you're spiritual now, everything is true. Once a person goes from a very material person to a very spiritual person, they think that everything in the spiritual world is true. And Judaism teaches that's not so. There are a lot of things in the spiritual world that could be untrue. And what Judaism is, it's a guideline, it's a map to the spiritual experiences. And if you don't have that, if you don't look at that, you can go off into areas that are not so kosher, not kosher at all even. So again, I caution people in reading Dr. Weiss, but this book in terms of his experience is really phenomenal. And he has some other books. I mean, I just want to briefly talk about some of the other things. I mean, in one of his other books, he talks about a woman that came to him and had back pains her whole life, years and years of back pain, and nothing could solve it. She did chiropractic, she took therapy, she took massage, nothing ever helped it. So she went to Dr. Weiss for other things. I think it was something else, and he induced her into an hypnotic state, and she went to a past life where she was actually a soldier in attacking a medieval castle. Her army lost, and she was captured. And they took her and the fellow soldiers, captured soldiers, up to the top of the castle, and they stood and they tied their hands and their feet, and they stood at the edge of the top of the castle over the moat, and someone threw a spear into them from the back, and they toppled over and died down in the moat. And she experienced this memory, so to speak, in her hypnotic state. And when she came out of it, she was crying and emotional. She came back next week, and her back pain was gone. There are a lot of stories like this, and there are people that do these types of things. Regression therapy. I met some doctors that actually do it. Again, I'm not sure I'm recommending it or not, but such things do happen, and Dr. Weiss does document them. One other book I want to mention with Dr. Weiss is that he has a book called Only Love is Real, and that's the idea of soulmates. There's a whole section on this. Judaism does believe in soulmates. We do believe that at the time of conception, there's a voice that goes out, a spiritual voice, a baskol goes out and says, this person is destined for that person. We do have an idea of destiny between soulmates. We do have an idea that a person can lose their destined soulmate. We do have an idea that you can find your destined soulmate, and if you don't work in your relationship, it becomes a failure. And people that are not destined can have loving, tremendous relationships. But there is a concept of destiny and a soulmate. There is such a concept. So Dr. Weiss in Only Love is Real, I'm going to be very brief about this. He has two patients he calls Pedro and Elizabeth, and they're both having very successful people. Elizabeth, I think, I think she's some sort of medical professional, and Pedro is a successful businessman. And they don't know each other, and they come to his office, Dr. Weiss's office, different times. But over time, all of a sudden realize they're having interesting past life experiences that seem to be similar, but from a different angle. So Pedro, for instance, has a past life where he goes back to Jerusalem in the time of the Romans, and the Romans have come into his town, and they're taking him and they're tying him up, and they're tying to a horse, and they're driving him over rocks, and he's dying, and he dies there in that past life in the hands of his beloved daughter. And his name, I think, is Eli, or Eli, And then Elizabeth, in another dream, another past life, she's the little daughter back in Jerusalem. She remembers her father Eli dying in her hands. It took a while for Dr. Weiss to think that, this could be two people with similar things. And they seem to be successful people, but not happy. Bottom line is that he had a ethical problem to bring them together and to tell them. The privacy laws did not allow him to reveal to them, each other's dreams. Now, he did arrange it that they should come into his office one after the other. He felt that he went out there to see them. One, I think, was Catherine's first, and then Pedro, or vice versa. And he did notice that there was a look, they passed between themselves, but nothing else. And after they left, it seemed like Dr. Weiss's plan to bring them together was not going to work, and he wasn't going to do anything to push it along. And then it turns out that they, perchance, happened to be at the airport going to at the same time to a certain location. Did not plan it, of course. And then because they had seen each other in Dr. Weiss's office, they decided to take seats next to each other, and their relationship began. And the bottom line is that they did get together. Dr. Weiss says they lived happily ever after. Again, you could have a soulmate and not live happily ever after. But this is a wonderful story that Dr. Weiss has. You see the idea of a reincarnation. Now, you don't have to believe this. Dr. Weiss does. And there are a lot of things that Dr. Weiss has. So these are types of things called evidence. I don't like to say proofs.